Welcome to another Revenue Roundtable. I'm Mitch Lee, Profit Evangelist at Vendavo, and we're going to spend under 10 minutes discussing what's being reported in business news, what's top of mind for the Vendavo customer community, and some tips, tricks, and capabilities to turn concerns into opportunities. With me today, Mike Slavin. He's one of our key BCs here in North America. Mike, how are you doing today?
Doing just great. It's Friday. It's been a long week. It's 95 degrees in Maine, which is unusual for us. So
I
it's all
feel your
good.
pain. It's 97 and 95 down here, 97 degrees and 95 down here in Virginia.
Yeah,
So first
cool.
up, hey Mike, we're still reading a lot about in the news about inflation. There's more and more data coming out. It's ramping up. It's not going away. What are you hearing? Tell us what you're reading. What catches your eye?
I'll tell you, inflation is one of those topics. It's probably second behind COVID in the news. That there's a lot of talk about what's going on with inflation. And earlier this week, one of the agencies put out a report about consumer prices. It might have been the Producer Price Index, and what they showed was that there's been a 7.8% year over year increase for the year ending the end of July. And,
Yeah.
and what's interesting about that is that roughly the same time, the Fed came out and they said, well, we've been looking at inflation and all the other economic indicators. We don't really feel that inflation is a problem at this point. And what's interesting about that is that their target rate for sustaining our economy going forward has been around a 2% inflation rate. So we're hearing 7.8% on one hand, 2% on the other hand, and then we're hearing from the Fed like, nothing to worry about. So it's certainly been an interesting topic, and it's got real people really thinking about this.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And actually,
And the
some
Fed is talking about tapering. So, they're probably
yeah,
balancing a lot of things with their messaging, right?
that's right. Yeah, and the Fed is a big mystery to most people. What they do and how things work, unless they do something really drastic, like they did back in the '70s when there was a real inflation problem. But a couple of buzzwords have popped up over the last few weeks that a year ago, nobody even related these to anything related to inflation. And that's this concept of transitory inflation and durable inflation.
Mm.
And durable, I think, is the easier one to explain. It's what the Fed looks at. That's kind of the ongoing inflation of core stuff that people buy and stuff that's happening in the economy. And the Fed is looking at that and they're saying, well, things aren't too bad. But then there's the transitory inflation, and transitory is stuff that's been more of a short-term type of thing. Some great examples that everyone's familiar with. Probably one of the first ones was toilet paper and paper goods. And when COVID started last year, all of a sudden there was all this excess demand for toilet paper, prices went up. More recently, the same thing was happening with lumber prices. And lumber is a great example because lumber, it was tied to increases in demand, some cutbacks on production. All of a sudden, lumber prices were going through the roof. So it affected housing prices and all these other things. And so what's interesting about this whole thing is that the Fed is choosing to kind of not so much ignore what's going on with these things, but not really give them a lot of credence as far as how they set policy. And when you think of the impact of inflation, there's really two areas. There's what the Fed is doing, and probably more significantly, there's just the whole idea of consumer behavior.
Sure.
Because in
Sure.
general, inflation is a problem if people think there's a problem.
Right.
Because if they think there's a problem, then they're going to take actions that they might normally not take. And a good example of that is big ticket items. If people think prices are going to be going up in the next few months, they might accelerate their purchases of these big ticket items. And what that's going to do then is it's going to put pressure on the manufacturers. The manufacturers are then going to have to raise their prices. The Fed's going to look at that and say, all of a sudden, production is picking up, sales are picking up. We need to do some sort of a monetary action on that. We're going to raise interest rates to cool things down, and it kind of gets into this whole vicious cycle. So it's really kind of an interesting place that we are right now.
And with respect to all this noise, what are we hearing from our customers, our partners, our people that in the pricing world? What does this mean for those folks?
Yeah, and that's a great question. And what's interesting is it kind of depends on who you talk to and what segment they are in in industries. People who are very reliant on imports, whether it's for components or finished goods, distributors that import finished goods, they're seeing a lot of pricing pressure because prices of imports have gone up quite a bit. And same thing, why have the prices gone up? Well, it's not a simple question. It's related to COVID affecting shipping rates going up. There was just a thing in the news just today that in China, I think their third largest port, they've shut down shipments over the short term because somebody tested positive for COVID. So that kind of stuff is really impacting things. So, companies that are relying on imports a lot, they're seeing a lot of pressure. And there's also a continuation of this idea of a kind of a supply demand disconnect.
Yeah.
And that being that, there's certain things where they're just not in good supply. And I think a lot of that was, if you look back, whatever it is, 15 months ago, when we had the initial lockdown and shutdown for COVID, what did companies do back then? It seems like ages ago. A lot of companies said, "Ooh, it looks like we're probably going to have a recession. So we want to be in front of the curve on the recession. We're going to cut back on production. We're going to cut back on resources."
Right.
And then reality turned out to be that there wasn't a broad-based recession. There was a recession in certain industries. So this supply-demand disconnect thing kind of, moved through the economy and through the supply chains as kind of a wave. And there again, the same thing. It affected certain commodities, but then other commodities weren't affected. Another great example is if you think of used cars. And I lived this. I bought a new truck. Well, not a new truck because I'm too cheap to buy a new truck. I bought a truck back in April. I bought a 2019 Nissan Titan pickup truck. And at the time, little did I know, it was a good time to buy a truck. I think I paid $34,000 for it. Looking at this thing on cars.com, a similar truck, similar mileage, similar condition. Now the price is up to $44,000. So just in a few months, there's been this massive increase in prices of used cars, which is one of those things, is that inflation or not inflation?
Yeah.
Used cars, the wholesale market is down a little bit, so maybe it's not. But if I'm a consumer, I'm looking at that thinking, well, maybe there is something going on.
Absolutely. So what can people do now? What are a couple of points, the things for pricing folks, for people in the C-suite? What can be done to make the most?
Yeah, that's a great question because we've really entered kind of a bizarro world of the economy. And I think we entered it back, 15 months ago. Didn't even realize we were in that, but we really are. Where historical trends and historical data doesn't necessarily apply to what's happening right now. And pricing professionals, we tend to rely on historical data to help predict what's going to happen as far as future demand and how it affects pricing. So I think this is a great example of what you need to do, and that you need to kind of keep your eyes open and try to figure out what's going on. And most importantly, be ready to be agile. It's all about being able to react when something does happen and make a change. So if you've got old systems, you're doing things on Excel, you're doing things with old mainframe systems where it takes you 4 months to put through a price increase, that's going to be a challenge because you may have to do something very quickly. Because I think in a lot of cases, people aren't going to realize that there's a problem until it's actually happened. And hindsight is going to say, boy, I wish we'd known this a month ago.
Absolutely. All that pressure around digital transformation before, now the value of that is terribly, terribly apparent. To your point about agility, you have to be able to run through a dozen different scenarios, maybe every week, because there's so many new things that's not in the data, that's not in the historical data.
Exactly. It's not in that historical data. And I think another thing to do is, pricing people, we tend to look at things from our perspective. I'm not seeing any price changes because I haven't changed any prices. Whereas if you think about the rest of your organization, you've got supply chain people, and supply chain people are dealing with a whole group of suppliers. So what are they hearing? Talk to your supply chain co-workers and find out what they're hearing from their suppliers. Are people trying to push through price increases? I think a lot of this is, it's kind of like the getting back into the office thing. It was moving for a while, then all of a sudden everybody's kind of like, oh, we don't know what we want to do. The same thing I think is happening with prices to a certain extent, where people are afraid to take the first move, and then all of a sudden something's going to happen. So as I said, it gets back to that agility thing. So keeping your eyes open, I think that's important.
Keeping your eyes open and having the capability to change on the dime. Mike, thanks so much for your time today. It's really great to see you, really great to hear from you today. For all of you watching or listening, thanks for joining us today. Be sure to contact us at profit@vendavo.com to let us know if you have any topics you'd like for us to address on the next Revenue Roundtable. So until we speak again, have a profitable day.
So long, everyone.